This video will give you a top-level introduction to theory and topicality arguments. Please take notes carefully and use them to prepare for your first lesson. Let's start with the purpose of theory and topicality. Unlike most activities that are competitive, debate is a game with very few rules that are non-negotiable. The only rules that are really not up for grabs in a debate round is how long each speech is and who speaks in what order. Everything else, literally everything else, is up for debate, including whether or not you have to defend the topic, whether or not you're allowed to defend a subset of the topic, whether or not you have to take certain actions before a debate, like disclose your positions online, whether or not you're allowed to read specific types of arguments within a debate. Unlike other games where the rules are very well defined ahead of time and the job of the judge is to enforce the rules, in debate you get to create rules as the game is played. So, this is important because it means that you get to propose rules that both competitors should follow in the debate. So for instance, if you think your opponent is not following a rule that you think is good for debate, you can make an argument that says they should have followed that rule and they should be punished for not doing so. What's unique about this then is that you get to play the role of judge, jury, and executioner within the context of a single debate round. Now, before we dive into the types of topicality and theory arguments and the tools used to make them, I'd like to give you some top-level notes that I think will ground our discussion and our learning together on theory and topicality powerfully. The first is that oftentimes students are overwhelmed by the amount of specialized jargon that theory and topicality debates have. It is very important for you to note that there is really no such thing as a bad question here. Theory and topicality debate in particular has a very specialized language that is used, and a lot of these words don't make sense in the context of normal English, and so you have to learn the context in which these words are being used to communicate properly within a debate round. So a lot of the first few sessions will be you learning this language powerfully. Now, the next thing I want you to understand is that you should think of theory and topicality debates as basically accusations of cheating. You're saying either your opponent cheated or you're defending that you did not cheat. Now, don't take these accusations super seriously. It's not a personal attack that you think your opponent cheated. Rather, it's a strategy within the space of debate as an argument you can make for why you think that the way that your opponent is playing the game is counterproductive, be it because it's unfair or it's uneducational or it's violating some other principle that you think is important. Great. So, we're going to start with giving you the formal structure in which theory and topicality arguments are made. One thing I want you to note is that in terms of jargon, the jargon that we will use will often be synonymously interchanged. So the formal structure here we will refer to in multiple ways, as will we refer to theory and topicality arguments in multiple ways. One way that we'll refer to theory and T is as procedural arguments. So the top level thing I want you to remember here with formal structure is that as you get more advanced and you understand this formal structure, you'll start using it less and less. Most of the advanced debates you'll see on the circuit will not include using this exact formal structure, but instead will become a streamlined and smaller version of the structure. So we're initially going to learn the traditional structure for the sake of education. So the first thing in the traditional theory shell, notice how also it's referred to as a shell. So a shell is one complete argument on a theory debate or a topicality debate, and you can have multiple shells. Just as you can have multiple impacts in a debate, each theory shell is its own standalone impact. So the shell starts with an interpretation and a violation. Think of the interpretation as the rule for debate that you are proposing. The rule for debate basically becomes analogous to the resolution in the debate. So in substantive debates or in debates about the topic, when you walk into the debate, it's already given to you what the topic is, and you know if you're going to be on the affirmative or the negative. In a theory debate, you create the topic by proposing the rule. So for instance, if I think you should do jumping jacks while you're giving the negative speech, my rule that I would propose would be the negative debater should do jumping jacks while delivering the one-hand seat. Now, obviously, let's imagine that I made that rule. It's a silly rule, but I think it creates a good opportunity for discussion. If I made that rule and you did indeed do jumping jacks while you read the negative speech, what would be the most intuitive response? The most intuitive response, hopefully, in your mind, is that, well, yeah, I agree with that rule and I met it. There's no violation. So that is why we think about the interpretation and the violation side by side. the interpretation only makes sense. The rule you're proposing only makes sense if your opponent has violated it. So it's very important to understand that reading a procedural argument that doesn't have a violation is extremely unstrategic because it means that your opponent is in agreement with you about the rule that you're proposing and there is no disagreement. Now, the next portion of a theory debate is called the standards. The standards is where the meat of the theory debate occurs. This is the most substantive portion of it. Usually 99% of the times when a theory argument is read, there's been a clear violation because you've confirmed it in cross-examination and it's just obvious that it's occurred. So the question becomes, is it good for this rule to be enforced? The question of whether debate would be better off or worse off with this rule is a question that is resolved on the standards debate. Think of analogously the standards on a theory shell or a topicality shell to be the same as the contentions that you read when you're reading an affirmative case or the advantages to a plan. So they're the same exact thing. And so you can have multiple standards in favor of the interpretation that you're reading. And we're going to review in depth what types of standards we are. But you want to think about standards as basically the reasons why your rule is good for debate. Now, the last portion of the formal structure of a traditional shell is what we call the voters. This is synonymously referred to as paradigm issues, and you should get comfortable with us interchangeably using these two words. Let's assume that you've proposed a rule for debate. Let's go back to the jumping jacks example. I say the negative debaters should do jumping jacks while reading the NC. They didn't do it, and so there's a clear violation. And then I give a couple of standards for why that's good. Maybe one of them is the value of multitasking, how this will really help debaters learn how to do two things at once, which is a key skill in the real world. Maybe a second argument I make is a argument about fairness skews. And I say that, look, the negative debater is significantly more advanced and better at debate than me, so we need to handicap them in terms of their ability to debate with us. And so I need an advantage, and making them do jumping jacks makes it way harder for them to debate, so that makes the round even. Both of these are really silly arguments, but let's say that we've made both of these arguments and that is the standards we've read. So the first standard is real-world education, and the second standard is reciprocity. Now, what happens if it turns out that the rule I've proposed is good for debate and that my opponent didn't follow that rule? Well, now we need to ask ourselves, what does the judge do with that? And that's where we talk about the voters. So the voters analyze the question of what should the punishment be in the debate and how should the judge evaluate this claim of cheating. Let's move on. So, as I just mentioned, the standards is where the meat of the theory debate occurs. Now, when we move away from silly examples like jumping jacks and we move to more concrete and relevant examples that are likely to come up in debate rounds, we start to come across two overarching categories of standards. The first overarching category is what we call fairness-based standards. Fairness you can think of synonymously as equity. Obviously, if you're playing a game, you want the game to be relatively fair. For instance, if we were running a race and one side was given a 20-second head start compared to the other side, we would say that that race was unfair. Similarly, if you're taking a test and you're being graded against your peers and one student shows up and is looking at answers on Google while taking the test, we would say that that is not a fair test now and a fair measure of your skill or your knowledge on something compared to your peer. So debate is the same exact way. One huge concern in debate is that we want to have a fair round. And obviously different people have different interpretations of what fairness means, and a lot of the purpose initially is going to be, or a lot of your education initially is going to be surrounding how to teach you what fairness standards are popular and how do you start applying them on your own. So there are two broad types of fairness standards. There are in-round skews and there are pre-round skews. So think about it as, how can we make a debate round unfair? Well, there are two general ways. We can make the debate round unfair within the debate, and then we can make the debate round unfair before the debate. So imagine that in the debate itself, I ended up reading a strategy that gave me exclusive access to a position that is very intuitively true. That would obviously probably cause some type of fairness skew, because it would mean that our opponent, the negative, has to debate against something that's just true, and the affirmative is the only one who gets to win on that argument, right? Another example is time skews. Time is obviously the only non-renewable resource. Let's say I read a strategy as the negative that says I can defend one of 6 things in the second negative speech, and the affirmative doesn't get to know what those are until I give the second negative rebuttal speech. So I just get to pick and choose just because. And if that is an argument the negative makes, then you obviously as the affirmative might complain and say that, hey, look, this isn't the fairest setup in the world because it's skewing our ability to have a fair debate in the round. So overarchingly, there are 3 types of fairness skews that happen in round. The first is strategically. So this is what we call a strategy skew. And the strategy skew tends to be one side claiming exclusive access or a monopoly over a key portion of the debate. The second is time skew, where a strategy has been read that disproportionately affects one side's time allocation compared to the other. And third is a quality of argument skew. And this basically says, look, the amount of arguments and how good they are end up being poorer for me because of the strategy you've read. So maybe you just have gotten to choose the best arguments, and the positions I'm forced to read now are counterintuitive and not fair. And so the literal arguments I have to work with are not equitably divided. So to clarify, there are 3 major types of in-round skews. And obviously there are more than just these 3, but these are the 3 most popular. Strategy skews, time skews, and ground skews. And notice how here now we're starting to introduce jargon. So one thing I want to highlight here for you is the importance of metaphors. Obviously in real debates, there's no real thing as ground. Ground ends up being a metaphor we use to refer to the amount of arguments both sides can make. Great. I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to move us to pre-round skews now. So we've talked about some major ways in which the debate can be skewed in round. How about ways the debate can be skewed before the round? Well, there are a couple of major ways that come to mind. One is that maybe one side, because of the strategies implemented in the debate, has to do significantly more research than the other side to be able to be competitive. So if we walk into a debate where debater A has to have 20 times the amount of preparation as debater B to have a fair shot, we would say that has caused a fairness skew because of the way that the allocation of responsibility was divvied up before the round. Another popular example here for how we cause skews before the debate is through the use of the online debate wiki. This is probably the most popular argument in the status quo for the types of pre-round skews that can occur. To clarify, disclosure is the practice of going to the NDCA LD wiki and literally disclosing the positions you've read after debates. And let's imagine that you're having a debate where you have disclosed everything you've read at the tournament, and your opponent just refuses to disclose everything on the wiki. Well, you would say that that has caused a pre-round skew now because there's information asymmetry. You have told your opponent everything that you're reading and have read, and you have no idea what your opponent is reading. So there's a lack of reciprocal access between both sides' ability to access information about each other in terms of the content of their arguments and their stylistic preferences. Now, similarly, there are multiple other ways in which people talk about pre-round and in-round skews, but these are the most popular ones at the topmost level I want you to note down and be ready to discuss with your instructor. So, to summarize, the pre-round skews tend to be around a lack of reciprocity with research burdens, and second, a lack of reciprocity with information access. Great. Now let's talk about education standards. So there are 3 types of education standards that are popularly referred to in debate. There are 3 overarching categories. 1 is in-round education claims, 2 is content education claims, and 3 is skill-based education claims. In-round education claims refer to the literal education you receive in the debate. The most popular standards are clash, breadth, and depth. Clash refers to literally the amount of substantive back and forth you got to have on any given issue. Breadth refers to the amount of arguments that were able to be introduced and covered in the debate. And depth refers to how much we talked about each of these issues one at a time. People often equivocate clash and depth, though there are some unique minor differences, because presumably we could have a lot of clash over a lot of arguments, and so clash is sort of distinct from depth in the sense that clash refers to just literally the actual back and forth that happens, and clash is agnostic over how many arguments are covered or how in depth they're covered. So you can say that clash is better done with debates that have a lot of arguments, or you can say that clash is better done with debates that have a limited amount of arguments, and you should think about all three of those standards as distinct. So let's ground it in an example. One of, hopefully, the things that you would say if somebody said you had to do jumping jacks during a speech is that, look, this would kill my ability to clash with my opponent because it would be so distracting. I wouldn't be able to focus, and we wouldn't have a good debate that was actually substantive about the issues in the debate that we're talking about. And that seems important because in a debate round, it seems like the major way we learn is by actually debating and going back and forth on any given issue. So if some rule that has been proposed compromises our ability to do that, then obviously that would be a disadvantage to the rule. The second broad category of education standards that are frequently brought up in theory and topicality debates is content-based education. So by content-based education, I mean types of debates and whether or not your rule encourages or discourages them. So for example, a classic example is policymaking education. A second example is philosophical education. A third example is topical education. A fourth example is critical education. These are types of arguments that are popular in debate, and one common argument for or against rules is to argue that, look, your rule that you've proposed or your actions that you've taken that have violated my rule make it very difficult for us to learn this type of education now. And that is bad for debate. So a good example is, if we go back to the disclosure example we were just talking about, if your opponent doesn't disclose anything that they are reading and you disclose everything you're reading, your ability to prepare for a topical debate where you actually talk about important arguments is compromised, right? And so the amount of topic education we get now in this debate might be a little bit lower because you didn't have the equal opportunity to prepare the way that your opponent did. Another common example that people use is when they talk about the value of philosophy. There is currently a divide in the national debate circuit over whether or not traditional philosophical debates are good or bad for education and for fairness. So you can argue both sides of this. You can say that, look, my strategy encourages philosophical debates, which is a key skill. And you can say, look, my strategy discourages philosophical debate, which is good because LD is not the best format or forum to learn philosophical education in the first place. Similarly, the examples go on and on and on, and we will dive deep into types of content-based education and practice and apply them. But at the topmost level, it's important for you to just understand that this is a popular way that we make arguments on education standards. And the last type of education standard, the last big category, is skill-based education. Skill-based education has multiple different types of skills we talk about. So the basic premise is that you say, look, the actions my opponent takes, the rules they're violating, hurt our ability to develop key skills that are near and dear to the purpose of debate. So what could those skills look like? Well, let's think about it. Some of the things I think debate teaches us that are really powerful is research skills. So that's one. Two is critical thinking skills. Third is advocacy skills, how to learn to advocate for stuff. And so if, for instance, your opponent forces you to do jumping jacks during the 1NC, hopefully one thing that you would say is that this hurts my ability to do this hurts my critical thinking skills because now I'm not able to actually focus on the arguments in the debate, and I'm not able to develop my skill set of learning how to think critically back and forth on a specific issue. So there are three types of skill-based education: advocacy skills, research skills, and critical thinking skills. And these are commonly persuasive reasons why certain strategies in debate might be uneducational and thus should be disbarred from access within debate in the first place. Great. So let's move on. Now let's look at some common examples of when theory and topicality arguments are read. Let's start with, does the affirmative have to define the assigned resolution? Let's imagine that your opponent shows up and they decide they want to debate last year's January-February LD topic instead of whatever the topic is this year. Well, what would be some complaints you had if they showed up and they're like, we want to debate last year's topic? Hopefully one complaint you'd have is you would think about this completely has skewed my pre-round preparation and has given you a huge fairness advantage now, because you're the only one prepared to actually talk about last year's resolution. You're the only one who has updated your preparation, who's practiced it, etc. Hopefully you'd think about this has also completely hurt our ability to get topic education on the current topic. This has completely killed our ability to do research, so we're hurting our research skills. The clash that we have in this debate will probably be a lot poorer now because I'm not prepared and ready to talk about what you want to talk about. And the general quality of the debate is going to be lower from a perspective of argument engagement, right? Because now we're basically talking about two different topics, so the debate is going to be messy at best. So similarly, on and on and on, you could probably come up with a bunch of different reasons why it's better for us to debate the topic that we're currently assigned instead of a topic we were assigned last year. Another example of an argument you could come up with is, what if you didn't debate last year? What if you're new to debate and you literally don't have any preparation to the topic from last year, right? So that would be a huge reason why it causes in-round fairness skews, because you literally don't even have access to the quality of arguments you would need to be able to have this topical discussion that they want to have of last year's topic. Now, one thing to note here is that there is no right and wrong answer in terms of the arguments you construct, and our goal is to teach you how to use the language and jargon of theory to construct arguments well. A second example is, let's say that we're talking about whether or not dogs are better than cats. What if the affirmative stood up and argued that a specific type of dog is better than a specific type of cat? Does that still prove the general statement that dogs are better than cats? This is a huge disagreement within the debate community right now in Lincoln-Douglas debate about whether or not the affirmative can talk about a specific example of the resolution to prove the resolution true. So this is popularly referred to as plans. Can the affirmative read a plan and defend only a subset of the resolution? Now, some common arguments in favor of it of reading a plan is that this creates better debates that are more in depth because we talk about one portion of the topic at a time. And so having a narrow focus is good. A second popular argument is that the affirmative should be given leeway to choose the starting point of the debate because affirming is harder than negating. And so being the AF is more difficult. And so the AF has to do the research to find a position that it wants to read. And so the AF should be given broad leeway to decide what that position entails. On the flip side, there are some common arguments in favor of the negative. One is that this makes research very difficult on the negative because the negative has to be ready for every single possible affirmative that could be read, but the affirmative only has to prepare its exact position, which means that the AF gets to choose one position and go deep on it, but the neg has to make sure it's ready to argue against all possible AF positions. So there's a huge skew in research burdens before the debate. Another popular argument is that the affirmative will have a competitive incentive to just choose an example of the resolution that's particularly true instead of a fair example that has controversy on it. And this is an argument that says basically, look, the affirmative will just choose the truest arguments and the truest examples that the resolution has and go to the extremes, and that leaves the negative with nothing substantive to respond to. We're not going to get super deep into this debate right now. The point of this is just to help you start seeing what are some examples we can use to construct competing reasons for the rules that we propose in debate. So the last one is, should debaters have to disclose their positions online on the community Wikipedia? I want you to come up with 2 reasons on your own note stock why you think disclosure might be good. And then I want you to come up with 2 reasons on your note stock why you think disclosure might be bad. And once you have done that, you can pause the video right now, and then once you've come up with those 2 reasons, keep moving with the video, and we can talk about those reasons during the lessons. So, let's say at this point we've proposed a rule. You've decisively established that your opponent has violated the interpretation and that the rule is actually good for debate. So at this point, we have come to the conclusion there's a rule we should follow, our opponent hasn't followed it, and that rule is good for debate. What do we do now? Well, we need to decide upon punishment. So what happens when we determine one side's cheated? The judge needs to decide, should the debate end? Should the person who cheated lose the entire debate? Or should a specific argument be crossed off the debate and become no longer relevant in the debate? So there are some factors you need to consider here when you're deciding upon a punishment. One is obviously proportionality. Disproportionate punishments could be bad because it could result in over-punishing, right? And this is a classic principle that we use when we look at institutions like the criminal justice system. This is why we would think it's bad if you steal a cookie from a store to be given the death penalty, right? Whereas we think it might make more sense for you to be given the death penalty if you were a mass murderer who killed, 40, 50 people. So having a sense of proportionality is important. A second factor to consider is the concept of deterrence. One goal of punishing people for cheating is to encourage them to not do it again. This is, if you think about it, the way your school system works. If you get caught plagiarizing on a essay that you submit for school, you're obviously going to get in trouble, and the goal of the teacher is to encourage you not to do this in the future, right? And so the punishment needs to be sufficiently punitive enough and scary enough that it encourages you not to end up committing that action again moving forward. We refer to this as deterrence. And then the third factor to consider is that we want to rebalance the debate in terms of the actual debate that's going on. So if one side cheated, then obviously the other side needs to be compensated for that cheating. Otherwise, if the judge resolves the debate without compensating the other side, the likelihood is that the side who cheated will have an advantage in the debate because they cheated. So these are the three factors we need to decide upon or weigh out in balance while we're deciding upon a punishment. The technical terms I want you to write down on your notes is that people refer to this as drop the debater, and it's abbreviated DTD, drop the debater, versus drop the argument, DTA. Please also note that people will synonymously interchange debater with team, and they'll synonymously interchange argument with position. So it can become drop the team versus drop the position. And this is the portion where we call a paradigm issue on the punishment that is administered as a result of cheating within a debate. And again, remember, at the topmost level, we decided that there are no preset rules, and you get to decide the rules. So you are the judge, jury, and executioner. You get to propose the punishment, and if you win, that's the right punishment. An objective judge should use that punishment to decide the winner of the debate. So the last thing I want to briefly cover with you in terms of the actual technical portions of how a traditional theory shell is argued is this paradigm issue that we call competing interpretations versus reasonability. We will go much more in depth on this later, but I want you to just start wrapping your head around this idea of, is good enough? In other words, if you propose a rule, do you have to propose the best rule possible for a debate, or do you just have to be simply good enough? There are persuasive arguments on both sides of this disagreement on how would debate be best. Would debate be best if everyone followed the best rules all the time? Or would debate be best if we allowed for just the standard to be good is good enough? The arguments in favor of reasonability that are most powerful are arguments about how if we're always looking for the best rule, we'll never actually end up talking about the topic, and we'll never end up actually having a debate about the resolution, because there's always probably another rule we could have followed that would have been slightly better. If we say you should disclose, we can always improve the way you should disclose and say you should actually have open sourced disclosed. And if you've open source disclosed, we can say, oh, well, you should have formatted everything properly on your disclosure page. And if you have formatted everything properly on your disclosure page, you can say, oh, well, you should have made sure everything was capitalized properly and there you had proper punctuation and grammar on your disclosure page, and so on and so forth. And so it seems like there's always the potential for you to introduce a more specific rule that your opponent should follow that they didn't. And the argument in favor of reasonability says, look, we should have a reasonableness approach to claims about cheating because the goal should be to have a debate about the topic. And if what one side did is good enough, then we shouldn't end the debate over an accusation of cheating because there wasn't actually cheating done. Cheating should be held to a high standard. Now, the other model says, look, we want the best rules possible for a debate because that creates the fairest debate. And that's the competing interpretations model of debate. So, hopefully this gives you a good sense of one of the core disagreements at the paradigmatic level of how theory debates are resolved. On one side, people say, look, if I'm being accused of cheating, I should be held to the standard of good is good enough, and I shouldn't have to show that I was perfect. And then usually the side that's accusing the other side of cheating says that, look, they should be held to a very high standard of excellence. They should not be allowed to get away with good is good enough. We should hold them and expect them to be great, not just good. So, to summarize here, there are a couple of strategic considerations I would like to chat about. The first is that procedural arguments tend to be evaluated first by judges. Remember that procedural arguments are synonymously referred to or interchanged with theory and topicality arguments. This is hugely important because it means that even if you're winning a substantive debate and you're winning that the affirmative is superior to the negative in terms of the actual topic, if your opponent introduces a procedural argument, then they basically can make irrelevant the substantive portion of the debate, and they can say, because you cheated, the debate should end here and they should win the round. So this is a very powerful strategy because judges tend to evaluate these claims before they evaluate anything else in the debate. The second big thing to remember is that the rules reset every debate. We started this conversation with there are only 2 rules that are non-negotiable. So you could theoretically stand up in a debate and say the negative must read jumping jacks while reading the 1NC, and then the next time that you have a debate, if the negative does jumping jacks while reading the 1NC, you could stand up and say the negative must not do jumping jacks while reading the 1NC. We call this bidirectional theory arguments. A better example that's not as silly, I like the silly examples because hopefully they help you wrap your head around the extreme nature of what you could argue. But a better example is whether or not you have to defend the whole resolution or if you're allowed to defend a specific example. If we go back to our dogs versus cats example, you could argue in one debate that the affirmative cannot argue a specific dog is better than a specific cat. It must defend generally that dogs are better than cats. And then when you become the affirmative, you could stand up and argue that I'm allowed to defend a specific dog versus a specific cat. That is totally acceptable. So the rules really do reset every debate, and you have to be ready to defend your rules or your assumptions of what you think makes good debates good in every debate. Now, please note that this does not mean you should read theory in every debate. Quite the contrary. One thing that we'll start talking about a lot as you start getting more advanced is the difference between legitimate theory claims and frivolous theory claims. The sillier and more frivolous the nature of your theory claims are, the less likely they are to be taken seriously by your judge, and the more easy they are to dispatch by your opponent. So the value you get out of reading silly arguments like you must do jumping jacks while reading the NC is quite low, especially when you're debating debaters that are strong at theory debating. So, hopefully that gives you a good sense of how theory debates work at the topmost level. The things I want you to make sure your notes are crystal clear on and that you're able to chat about with your teacher is 1, the traditional structure of a theory shell, its components, and the most popular arguments in favor and against. 2, the examples we ran through and understanding some of the popular arguments for and against some of the core disagreements in debate. And 3, any questions you have or things that weren't clear from this video. And to summarize and conclude, topicality and theory are core arguments in debate, and you have to get comfortable with them and learn them. And you should think of these debates as a question of, did your opponent cheat or make debate actively bad by employing the strategies they used? When people read theory arguments against you, you should think about it as, I'm being accused of cheating and I need to defend my practices. And when you read theory arguments against other people, you should think about it as, I'm accusing them of cheating and they need to defend their practices. Hopefully this was helpful. Feel free to message me if you have any questions about this, and good luck.